welcome to another episode of Death Drive Dialectics. I'm Tyler Mraz, and with me is Nicholas Tolliver, as usual. Today, we are interviewing the esteemed historian and political theorist Vijay Prashad. He is director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the author of some of our favorite books concerning imperialism, such as The Darker Nations, of course, and Washington Bullets, A History of CIA, Coups, and Assassinations. We bring Vijay Prashad here today because he, using thorough materialist analysis, demonstrates a profound understanding of the brutal violence at the heart of capitalist expansion, which has been rearing its ugly head in Gaza over the last year, for over a year now. We bring Professor Prashad on today to illuminate modern imperialism and specifically the conflict in Palestine. Welcome, Professor Prashad, and again, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, but I'm not a professor. No, because to be a professor, you have to have an academic job. Okay. And lucky for me, I keep losing them. And so I get to spend time with you.
Okay.
So it's a fortune and charm. Yeah.
All right. Fair enough. Well, today you'll be teaching us about certain things. So, for all intents and purposes, you're our professor today. And if you
one of the places I wanted us to start is with one of the biggest and most recent developments in modern imperialism, which is the election of Donald Trump. What do you feel like it means for Trump to be at the head of American imperial power at this time?
It really depends from whose perspective you're asking, So for instance, let's take the situation from around the world. During Biden's presidency, the United States, and I'm talking just today, I'm just talking about the last 24 hours, okay? The last 24 hours of Biden's presidency. Number one, his ambassador to the United Nations vetoed a ceasefire resolution in the UN General Assembly, 14-1. That means it didn't go through. Number two, he allowed the Ukrainian government to fire US long-range missiles onto Russian territory. I mean, you put these two things together and you think from the perspective of a child in Gaza, or from the perspective of anybody who doesn't want to see World War III break out, could Trump be any worse? Like, could you be any worse than genocide? Could you be any worse than planetary destruction? In that sense, from the perspective of, let's say, planetary destruction or a young child in Gaza, there is no real, maybe qualitative difference between the presidency coming of Trump and of Mr. Biden. In fact, interestingly, if you take a hard-boiled look at it, the Trump presidency might entangle itself in a set of contradictions that could actually provoke different outcomes. For instance, Henry Kissinger produced a giant book called China, where he made a very respectable argument in US foreign policy circles, arguing that one of the most dangerous things in the planet for the United States is if China and Russia get closer together and then dominate, effectively the largest landmass, habitable landmass, which is Eurasia. So Kissinger suggested that the way to prevent this is for the United States to build a strategic relationship with China, take the Chinese approach and isolate Russia. That was Kissinger's approach. In a sense, Mr. Trump, following another very old lineage in US foreign policy since the 1990s, has kind of a reverse Kissinger, which is, let's, as the United States, befriend Russia, get close to Russia, and break the Russia-China alliance, and then allow Russia and the United States to isolate China. Mr. Trump is in a reverse Kissinger position. Now, this is going to entangle him in all kinds of knots this time around. For instance, since he was last president, the Russian government and the Venezuelan government have got very much closer. So if Mr. Trump is going to try to peel away the Russians, which is impossible, from its deepened alliance with the Chinese, He's not going to be able to pursue the John Bolton strategy, the Marco Rubio strategy of regime change in Venezuela and Cuba. The Russians will object to that. I mean, people say, well, yeah, but Marco Rubio is his Secretary of State. Listen, the Secretary of State is a largely ceremonial post. You basically do the bidding of the president. It has about 1 or 2% of the military budget, is the Secretary of State's budget. Rubio is not going to be able to drive a policy. Trump has sandwiched Rubio between Tulsi Gabbard, who is an anti-interventionist, and other people. So he is not going to. In other words, is Trump going to be so much worse for the world? I don't think so. Is Trump going to be able to wreak unlimited damage on the world? I think he'll wrap himself up in contradictions, because the world is changing rapidly and the United States cannot control it except by military force, and that military force itself may not be sufficient.
I mean, yeah, I think that you're seeing that with what's happening with the Houthis in Yemen, that they cannot be compelled by military force to cease their solidarity strikes in the Red Sea. Though we're already seeing limits to U.S. imperial might all around.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the Yemen situation. I just, sent out an article through Globetrotter on the Yemen situation. This is really interesting because the Yemeni government, which is run by a political organization, Ansar Allah, the Yemeni government has taken a strong position since the genocidal attacks on Gaza, very strong position. In fact, not only have they hijacked ships going through the Red Sea, because the gate that is between Djibouti and Yemen is only 14 nautical miles across, and Yemen's territorial waters are 12 nautical miles. It's very difficult for a ship to go through there without going into Yemeni waters. So they seized these tankers. They seized Galaxy Leader in last year. Well, okay. Then they fired missiles. Now, what's going on? You see, if you go through the Red Sea, what the Israelis have done is there's a point between Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, and Jordan, the port of Aqaba, Jordanian port of Aqaba. There's a tiny space where Israel has access to the Gulf of Aqaba, and they have built the port of Eilat there. Well, Yemen has been striking the port of Eilat. It's been closed down for the last 8-9 months. In fact, the private operators of the port have complained to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, asking for funds because they can't keep the port open. It's been shut down, and that's by rocket attacks from Yemen. Not only Yemen, from Bahrain, from Iraq, from parts of Jordan as well. There have been all kinds of groups firing rockets at the port of Eilat and also trying to get to Israel. United States, what did the US decide to do? Firstly, they started 2 different campaigns, the most recent being Operation Poseidon Adventure. This year, Mr. Biden was asked, has the US bombing, in other words, Poseidon Adventure, had an impact on the Yemen campaign? And he said, no, it has not had an impact. Then the journalist asked him, are you going to continue? And he said, yes, we are going to continue. In fact, it's not just Biden. His rear admiral gave a webinar in Washington a few months ago where he also said, we're having no impact, but we're going to keep doing it. I mean, it is incredible how US power, military power, I'm not talking about other forms of military power, is constrained when an adversary such as the Yemeni government just doesn't care. The US government sent out a B-1 bomber to go and bomb 5 underground targets in Yemen. It's not even clear that they hit anything. And it's a joke because the Yemeni drone is about $2,000 a drone. It takes the United States $2 million to knock out each of those drones. Just do the calculation between a $2,000 drone, which you can buy from Amazon and then retrofit, and a $2 million missile that is used to take it out. I mean, the Yemenis are bankrupting the US.
Yeah. I think it's particularly interesting concerning the ineffectiveness of a lot of U.S. military might. but also the ineffectiveness of communicating that back at home, whether it be the GOP or the Liberal Democratic Party. There seems to be real inability to articulate what exactly we're doing with our military, why it's so inefficient, and why we're spending so much money. So we do have a question about why you think there is a failure of liberal ideology or a failure of liberalism, its inability to successfully articulate legitimization of this imperialist project, especially with all the ways in which the globe is changing and imperialism is changing.
I mean, look, the first thing about liberalism is that it doesn't want to look like a hammer, you know. It would like to appear as if it's doing something good in the world, right? You know, they are bringing civilization to the natives, bringing security, international rules-based order, all of this stuff, you know. The kind of thing that you hear Antony Blinken saying, you know, international rules-based order. But here's the funny part of the whole thing, is people aren't buying it anymore. Recently, Britain's Keir Starmer at the G20 meeting had a bilateral with Xi Jinping of China. In the bilateral, Keir Starmer proceeded to harangue Xi Jinping about the situation in Hong Kong, talking about democracy. Now, let's take a breath. Hong Kong. Hong Kong was seized by the British during the end of the First Opium War in 1842. The British basically fought a war not against drugs, for drugs, so that British companies could sell opium, dump opium into the Chinese market. So the British fought a war to force the Chinese to take opium. Some of the most distinguished corporations at the time, Jardine Matheson and so on, Barclays, were involved, including US companies, the families like the Forbes family, the Astor family of Astor Place in New York City. All of them were drug dealers. Anyway, the British seized Hong Kong and took a long lease on it. Well, the lease, 150-year lease, ran out in 1997. Between 1842 and 1997, the British controlled Hong Kong as a colony. There was no talk of democracy. In fact, in 1984, there was a conversation started in Hong Kong about having an elected legislative council, and the British just put the foot down against it. When Hong Kong reverted to China in 1997, the end of an illegal lease, really, the seizure, 1842, then suddenly the British started to talk about democracy and elections. So, you know, here's Keir Starmer lecturing Xi Jinping about democracy in Hong Kong, and people around the world watch that and they think this guy is a clown. I mean, we know the history, you know, Keir Starmer. You can't fool us. We know that, you know, you are an old colonial power. You held India from 1757 till 1947. You never allowed any democracy, you know. There was a limited franchise election in 1937, 10 years before India won its independence. But what about from 1757 to 1937? And you can't say, well, the world wasn't having democracy. You know, Britain itself had started elections long before 1937. Nobody believes them anymore. You know, that's the key issue, is that when you say liberalism and imperialism, the kind of velvet glove that they would like to put over the iron fist, it no longer fits. It's shabby. It's lost its texture.
Yeah, I want to ask you about why that glove doesn't fit, because the violence hasn't changed. You know, the violence still remains the same, whether it's, you know, Vietnam or the Iraq War or what's happening in Gaza. You know, mass slaughter, killing civilians, indiscriminate bombing. But they've gotten so much worse at manufacturing consent for these imperial projects. Why do you feel like that is?
Yeah, I mean, look, frankly, there's a problem that the West faces, which is that as a consequence of, let's call it, the turbulence of capitalism, it's a euphemism, the turbulence of capitalism, as a consequence of that, there's been some pretty bad management, you know. I mean, capitalism doesn't permit better management of its turbulence. So, for instance, let's say there's a big financial crisis, right? 2006, 7, and 8. There's that big financial crisis. Banks have gone crazy. They lent money to people who couldn't pay their mortgages and so on. At the time, the US government had the tools to do various things, which would have hastened in a kind of evolutionary way to minor socialism. What? What could it have done? The Obama administration could have immediately said, look, we're just going to use fiat money, the money that we can print, to basically buy all distressed properties and convert all those owners into renters so that there are no evictions. That's the first thing we're going to do. Fiat decision. Everybody becomes a renter. The government owns all this property. Nobody's going to be evicted. Secondly, all the banks with bad paper just go broke. We are not bailing anybody out. Let them go. It's the free market. They failed, they go. We'll reconstruct the system. Then the government comes in and builds a proper credit system for the people. And now you already have a credit system in the United States. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae, these things exist. They are supposed to underwrite the collapse of, but nobody wanted to finance it. Why? Because the financiers walked away with the money and didn't allow a soft socialism. So capitalism doesn't permit a move like that, because Mr. Obama couldn't go in that direction. He had to bow down before private property. That's the restriction on government movement against capitalist turbulence, rather than say, we're just going to buy all the distressed properties, or better yet, we're just going to let the banks collapse and then we're going to buy the distressed properties at 10 cents to the dollar. Why should they pay price? Yeah. They're distressed properties. Tell, the mortgage companies, we're going to just take over all these REITs and so on, 10 cents to the dollar. That's what we're paying. We're just going to take and convert. Can't do that. And you can't do that because of private property. A private property prevents the ability to do something like that, and that's the constraint that capitalism places. It is what Marx identifies as private property is the fetter on capitalism. It prevents the kind of policy decisions that could be made.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on that, this lack of, I mean, the constraints on capitalism kind of preventing it from crafting, or preventing its ability to craft a story. It seemed like previous eras of imperialism had these tight, not waterproof, but these stories that were able to be ideologically communicated and advertised to the public. But this seems to be that our modern era of imperialism, or contemporary imperialism, there is a lack of a story, at least from the liberals' perspective. And I think this points to what you and your comrades at the Tricontinental Institute coined the term hyper-imperialism to describe geopolitics and the political economy of the 21st century. So if we can get into that, what is hyper-imperialism, and how is imperialism changing, and perhaps how does the new Trump presidency, how is that another demonstration of hyper-imperialism, and what is it?
Yeah, it's interesting, Tyler, because here's the problem is that over the course of the last few years, there's been some confusion, in my opinion, on what imperialism is. There's been a kind of, let's put it quite bluntly, lazy borrowing from earlier texts on imperialism and a mapping of those, imperialist geographies onto the present. So let me give you an example. The classic text is Lenin's Imperialism, written in published in 1916-17. He wrote it actually in the middle of the Russian Revolution. He was drafting it, putting it together. Okay, what was Lenin interested in that text? It's not a general theory of imperialism. He wasn't sitting down and saying, I want to write a treatise on imperialism. Lenin was interested in answering a simple question. Why did the social democratic parties vote for the war credits? Why did, the German social democrats capitulate to the warmongers? He wrote a conjunctural analysis. He was interested in why national-based corporations, national-based companies wanted to use their nation's power for extraterritorial markets and so on. And the clash, the inter-capitalist clash, then manifests itself as an inter-imperialist clash. It's a sublime analysis of why World War One occurs, but it's not a general theory. You can't extract from that text principles of imperialism and say these are eternal. Lenin would slap you if you did that, because Lenin deeply believed in drawing the theory from the facts. Indeed, he publishes the text in 1917. The world has changed because the capitalist countries start to mute their differences amongst each other and focus their problem with the USSR. They all basically stop World War One for a moment and invade the USSR, the young revolutionary republic, the British, the German. Everybody is thing, and then they conduct the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, get out of the war, and so on. It was deft handling in the early years. So Lenin understood from 1917 to his death in 1924 that the things had changed in the world. He didn't update the text Imperialism because the text was about explaining what happened, in the Great War. From 1917 till really 1989, the world crisis was focused around a conflict between the capitalist bloc and a socialist bloc, with the third world jockeying and vying for power. There was really very limited inter-imperialist conflict. It is true that German capital and Japanese capital emerged to threaten US capital. But look what happens. The moment the United States felt that Japan was getting too big for its boots, summons the Japanese to the Plaza Hotel in New York, forces them to renegotiate their interest rate, and that's the Plaza Accord. 10 years later, in the 1990s, when the Plaza Accord went too far, they summoned them back and they did the reverse Plaza Accord. In other words, German and Japanese capitalism, even though competitive with US firms, big difference between inter-firm competition and the competition between national capitals. The big bourgeoisie in these countries was not competing with each other to the death. They were not willing to go to war for external markets and so on. They were, in fact, the big bourgeoisie particularly was integrating with each other in a very precise way. And then after the Soviet Union collapses in 1989, the integration deepens with the global commodity chains, finance markets, the role of a company like BlackRock, which manages the assets of an enormous number of capitalists from different countries. Of course, there is inter-firm competition, car companies vying with each other, but that's different from international-based capitals competing with each other. Volkswagen produces cars in the United States. Okay, so now what is Volkswagen? Is it a German company? It's just closing down factories in Germany. So what we see is, in this period, as the United States attempted to create a kind of eternal hegemony, the internal turbulence, which I talked about earlier of capitalism, weakened the US. Its elites have become detached from any kind of social commitment, patriotism, and so on. And you got the rise of the big economies of the South, China, India, Indonesia, and so on. At the point when the Western economic hegemony was deeply threatened, is deeply threatened, almost to the point of an existential crisis, the United States led its bloc of countries to begin a military campaign almost against its adversaries to, roll back China, weaken Russia, and things like that. So hyper-imperialism is this singular focus of the US leading a Western alliance to basically, go all the way to war in order to maintain the power of the United States. And so that's why we call it, dangerous. It's dangerous because willing to go all the way to war, as in Ukraine, telling the Ukrainians, they can fire US and British missiles onto Russian territory. Very reckless, very provocative, and decadent, because they don't have any way to extricate themselves from a long-term crisis. They don't have any mechanism to extricate themselves without warfare. I mean, recently the Chinese have finished building a $3.5 billion 15-berth port in Peru. What did the United States provide to Peru? Used subway cars from the BART subway system in San Francisco for Lima's metro. So here the Chinese build a $3.5 billion port, and the United States shows up with used subway cars, and then a massive military presence. This is the decadence of the US elite. And Trump, in a sense, is the real epitome of the danger and decadence. He's extremely dangerous, erratic, mercurial. He's trying to bring patriotism back into the elite, or dismiss the elite. Tell them you're all fired and we're going to create a new elite, a patriotic elite. But he's dangerous, but he's also decadent. He has no new ideas. I mean, if your ideas man is Elon Musk, God save you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask something else, Nick, real quick about, I feel like intimately connected to what you describe as hyper-imperialism is the ideological success of someone like Trump, but also just in general anti-immigrant hysteria across the US and Western nations in general. What role does hyper-imperialism, these material changing material conditions, play in the rising, I don't know if you would call it fascistic, but the rising right wing in many Western countries?
We really don't like the word fascism to be used much because, for good reason. This has become part of the liberal playbook. My God, the fascists are at the gates. Vote for Kamala Harris. The fascists are at the gate. Defend Olaf Scholz's government. The fascists are at the gate. Keir Starmer is your best bet, and so on. This is an extremely interesting ideological revival of the term fascism. I think it started, if I'm not mistaken, during the time when Trump first appeared as a political candidate in 2014-15. The term fascism began to be bounded about. New fascism, fascism studies, and so on in the US. We generally think of this as the far right of a special type. That's the phrase we are playing with in the Institute. What do we mean by that? Firstly, unlike classical fascism, there really isn't a left-wing threat. Fascists don't have to come to disassemble, a big left-wing project, trade unions, communist parties, and so on. It's not there. The left is not a threat at all. Secondly, the fascist groups or these far-right nutcases are themselves unable to make an appeal to the public. They may join broad coalitions of the far right, but this is not being driven by the American Nazi Party or some neo-Nazi group in Germany or whatever. They are part of a broad upsurge of the right, but I think they are still marginal to it. I think more interesting is that as social democracy and liberalism collapses, really collapses into a politics of the neoliberal pact, where the old conservatives and the old liberals came together in this neoliberal pact, and they basically have lost their legitimacy. The far right has used all democratic processes to expand its power. They used elections. Brexit was an election thing. Marine Le Pen is fighting in elections. Trump won an election. He may not have, by the end of it, he may not have even won the popular vote as the counts keep changing. But he definitely won the election. Yeah. And nobody contests that. So they don't have to seize power extra judicially. I know there was January 6th and so on, but that was a kind of mockery of, let's say, the burning of the Reichstag. I mean, there was some fellow wearing like buffalo skins and some weirdos with face painted. This was not the kind of absolute threat, to, the burning of the Reichstag was a serious plot of the far right wing, the fascistic wing. They burnt the parliament. They said we don't need a parliament.
Even the beer hall putsch was a more serious attempt at state power.
and they felt we don't need the democratic institutions. In fact, the interesting thing about the far right of the special type is they feel perfectly comfortable taking power through democratic institutions, which means two things, two implications politically. You have to fight them culturally because they are beginning to root themselves in the culture generally. They have become both the elites. Remember, I said Trump is going to say, the old elite is fired, I'm going to create a new elite. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
a patriotic elite. And secondly, they've built a mass base of people who feel like they are going to save them. Trump doesn't need to say, this is how I'm going to create jobs. He just says, I'm going to create jobs. And he says it, with such forcefulness. Bill Clinton used to say, all of you can be entrepreneurs. Everybody knows that everybody can't be an entrepreneur. That was a dumb, hollow, scary thing to say to people. You can be an entrepreneur. No, I can't actually. Sorry. But Trump doesn't say that. Trump says you can all have jobs. You should all have good jobs. And then his running mate says, women need to have babies. And all of this is talk of stability, which people don't experience in a precarious landscape where your work land thing is precarious. You don't know if you can build a family life. Everything is precarious. It's shit. The world is, the tectonic plates are moving rapidly under you. And then along come these fellows and they promise stability. This is interesting. There's a lot to learn from them. Obviously, we don't go around saying, there should be a nuclear family and the father should be the patriarch. That's the opposite of what I believe. But I also believe that people need a narrative of stability. They don't want you to come and just tell them, listen, your life is precarious. I know my life is precarious. Sell me a dream, man. There's nothing wrong. And in many ways, the liberals don't know how to sell a dream anymore, and the left has for too long become the resident critic in the room of the situation, and rather than be the the dream catcher for the people. And I think there's got to be a little more dreaming put on the table from us, because otherwise the far right of a special type will be the only dreamers around.
Yeah, I think that I really like what you said about the far right of a special type. I think it speaks to the decadence that you describe in hyper-imperialism. That, because of the constraints that the capitalists, the monopoly capitalists have placed on our ability to reform the system, that we go to decadence to resolve these material conflicts. That, when people lack stability and security in their economic lives, even in the imperial core, they reach out for that stability, and they reach for people that give them answers and that give them, attempts at creating stability. And it seems like the left and even the liberals cannot promise anything economic that would assuage people's material needs. And so they are reaching out to racism, to, patriarchy, to all these, other ways of, social, cultural signifiers of stability. Do you feel like, the left, what do you think we should do to address people's needs?
I mean, look, we have a compelling story to tell. Yeah. We have a very compelling story. I mean, if you're living in a place like Minneapolis, let's say, wouldn't it be better if we could figure out better internal rail systems so people don't have to commute for such a long time to get to a job? Wouldn't it be great if rather than spend so much of the money on let's say military weapon systems, F-35 bombers and so on, instead of that we built community centers, we had people out there building things that are bring happiness and some sense of hope to children. It's stunning that in a country as wealthy as the United States, there are no community centers where children can just come in and learn how to play the guitar for free, play the piano or learn how to paint. All these things have become commercialized. Parents have to pay extraordinary amounts of money for after school activities. All this stuff should be part of just being alive. This also means that our social wealth would fund artists and teachers and so on. There should be, sports fields built, where and maintained, where kids could come and play, swimming pools maintained, built and maintained. I mean, all of this is employment, to create happiness and joy in society, rather than have people work precarious jobs, struggling to find clients, to pay your bills and that kind of thing. We have a compelling story to tell. We want to build a happy civilization. We shouldn't be embarrassed about it. But to do that, we have to disempower the powerful. We cannot allow them to take all the wealth. We cannot allow a system to be built that's premised on creating wealth for the few and misery for the many. We want to build, in fact, a civilization which brings happiness and stability for the many. That's what we want to build. Listen, you live in a neighborhood somewhere. You want maybe every 2 streets to have a clinic where if you're not feeling well, you just stroll down and walk in and get seen by a nurse practitioner. You don't have to make an appointment. You don't have to pay anything. It's just part of being alive. It's like having a fire brigade in a community. You want health clinics. You want, I don't want a bifurcated schooling system, expensive private schools with uniforms for some kids and the rest go to poorly funded things. I want good schools for everybody. Look, in Kerala, in the state of Kerala in India, there's a left government. When the government came to power this last, 5 years ago or so, most of the middle class families were sending their kids to private schools. In this last 5 years, this has reversed. People are sending their kids to the public schools. Why? Public schools conditions have improved. They've put money into it. They've inspired teachers. They've done small things like improve computer labs. They've painted the buildings. These things matter. You walk into a public institution, you don't want to see it shabby. The notices peeling. You want the public officials to have a sense of pride. Some time back, I went into a welfare office. I was thinking of writing a story in New York City. Miserable, it's miserable. You come in, the waiting area is dirty. There's no concern for the average citizen. You can't talk about, building a new society or being a rich country if your public institutions are worn down. Yeah. And this is not just like a welfare office. You go and you arrive at a US airport. Things look broken. They don't look fixed. You need investment in basic, your basic capital goods. And for that, you need to have control over your money. Can't allow the rich to just hoard the money. You got to build infrastructure. Roads should not be in such a bad situation. Trains should be in a better way. These are simple things that you can put forward. Like if there was a high-speed train from Minneapolis to Chicago, I don't know how long it takes now. Between Shanghai and Beijing in China, these two main cities on the eastern seaboard, the train used to take 34 hours. Okay, that was the time that the train took. They refurbished everything. The train now takes 4.5 hours, sometimes 4 hours. From 34 hours to 4 hours, it goes at 320 kilometers an hour. That's extraordinary. The Amtrak is about 100 and some kilometers an hour. The Acela between Boston and Washington, and most of the time runs at 80 kilometers an hour. If we had investment capital available, we could invest in these things, make society better. But there is no capital available. Why? Because the rich are hoarding it. And that's private property. That is why the solutions for the United States don't exist within capitalism. You've got to advance into a socialist system. But until that happens, you've got to fight to improve things. And the fight to improve public services is very important. It's paramount. You can't give up on them. The fight to improve basic public services. And here also volunteerism counts. In a community, if people volunteer to clean a public park, it sends a real message to the entire community, to the city as well. And people on the left, I think this is one part of our tradition that has, I think, whittled a little bit, which is coming together to volunteer. There are well-meaning people who volunteer at soup kitchens and so on. But I'm also talking about a different kind of volunteering. Imagine in New York City, yeah, group of people volunteer. They could just go up and clean a public park, that's available to everybody, and don't do it with lots of social media. Just do it. Let the neighbors participate, inspire people, start a movement, and that's how you actually establish the dream, that you actually teach people that they can get involved in fighting for better public services and so on. That's the beginnings of a confidence that people need to have. People are feeling demoralized. They need to have a confidence that they can act. I think that's really a kind of broad strokes thing about the role of the left in this kind of situation. Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate that answer. I think it's so important, for us to, fight for, well-funded public institutions and to not, cede the public sphere. I feel like so much of the U.S. is privatized, where people don't even know where to gather. There is none of these, spaces. We have to build these spaces.
Yeah,
I really like that answer.
Our capacity for resistance and coming together has been totally annihilated. Well, not totally, but certainly.
We got our work cut out for us.
Effectively, yeah.
Wow.
You want to go ahead and ask the next question, Nick?
Yeah. I wanted us to switch gears a little bit to talk about Palestine and the ongoing genocide. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, why is the U.S. and Western nations so invested in Israel's genocide in Gaza? And how is the U.S. advancing its imperial interest by supporting Israel so unreservedly?
I mean, one of the things I think that's important to recognize is that there really isn't a gap between Israel and the United States. For many years there used to be this debate: who is the dog, who is the tail? And I think the debate is moot and ridiculous. The United States and Israel operate hand in glove and have done so for a very long time. I think part of this is part of the hyper-imperialist agenda, which is, if the Palestinians make gains and are able to, let's say, eke out even a stalemate, let alone a victory, or if Hezbollah is able to transmit its defiance in Lebanon, if the Ansar Allah government in Yemen is able to establish its defiance, these acts of defiance, which the United States erroneously calls Iranian backed, these acts of defiance are equal to the act of defiance, say, of Cuba, of refusing to surrender to the blockade. What is very clear to me is imperialism does not tolerate at all defiance. Defiance is utterly, not disallowed. I mean, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. government made an assessment of the world, and they coined a term which used to be very much more used than it is now. The term is rogue states. And Anthony Lake, who was then in the State Department, wrote an article where he listed the rogue states pretty cavalierly. It's like a shopping list. Syria, the People's Democratic Republic of Korea or North Korea, Libya, Cuba, whatever. It's just a list. Okay, and the term was extraordinary, rogue states. Rogue states. Why rogue states? And what's rogue about them is they're defying the United States government. And that's not to be tolerated. You can't defy the United States government. Palestinians defied Israel. And it's not October 7th. People who think, no. Palestinians have defied the will of Israel since at least 1948, when they refused to disappear. And then certainly since the Likud government came to power in 1977, when they put a pressure, immense pressure on the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory to basically either surrender, become second-class citizens of Israel, or withdraw, go to Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt, the so-called three-state solution. Yeah, just leave the area. But the Palestinians have refused. They have defied, and their defiance, since at least 2005, has received serious pummeling. This war now, 2023-24, this has been called a genocide. Yes, true. But the Palestinians of Gaza have been punctually attacked by the Israelis with US weapons since 2005. The Israelis have routinely seized land through settlements in the West Bank. I mean, the extermination of Palestinian defiance has been on the cards for a very long time. As I said, you can go back to 1948. You can go back to 1977 when Likud comes in. I mean, you can start the clock whenever you want to start it. But it's very clear that the United States backs Israel's attempt to end the defiance, quote unquote, of the Palestinians in that region, because there's a belief that if Palestinian defiance succeeds, it will become contagious. And this is exactly the language the US uses with Cuba. If the Cuban Revolution's defiance succeeds, it will become contagious. Others will also defy. And
That's
so
why
therefore
they're
the
on
rogues...
state sponsors of terrorism list. That contagious, that, a Cuba will lead to a Grenada, will lead to a Nicaragua,
And in fact, again, look at your examples. In fact, again, the United States is correct, because Cuba did lead to a Nicaragua 1979. Cuba did lead to a Grenada 1983. I mean, your examples are proving the fact, which is that the US government is right to fear defiance. But that's what it's fearing. It's not fearing the lack of democracy. Come on. Freedom House, based in Washington, D.C., basically, it's a slightly respectable CIA front organization. Freedom House, in its most recent report, categorizes Israel as a free society. Now, how do you categorize Israel, which is, an apartheid society, which is occupying the Palestinian territories of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank? How do you characterize Israel as a free society? You characterize Israel as a free society, but the rogue states are all unfree. And it's precisely, these lists are all the same. Whether you look at the corruption index or the Freedom House index or whatever, all the indices are the same. They are not actually measuring lack of democracy or corruption. What they are measuring is amount of defiance of the US agenda, and whether that defiance is contagious makes them more and more dangerous.
Yeah. So the genocide then is, this response to this defiance, their inability to accede to Israel's, total violence and desire for total control. What does that mean then for the potential outcomes that we could see? If we're thinking about this through the lens of hyper-imperialism, what would hyper-imperialism, what would that framework tell us about, what is likely to happen moving forward?
I mean, look, it's impossible to tell, directly. I mean, why? Because, as we are speaking today, the United States vetoed Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. Increasingly, and it's taken a very long time, and that's disheartening to an extent. Increasingly, more and more countries are, deciding not to send goods to Israel. Colombia decided after a very long time to no longer send, coal to Israel. Israel is going to have a hard time getting things like coal and so on. It's now relying on South Africa, but the unions in South Africa are pushing the government to block coal shipments to Israel. All of this is going to have an impact. The United States cannot bail out every country in the world and remain powerful, particularly its allies. The government is going to fall in Germany. There will be elections in other parts of Europe. It's very clear that the far right of a special type will make gains. I don't think the United States can control that. In Ireland, it looks pretty clear that if all things go as they are going, Sinn Féin is going to take former government in Dublin. and Sinn Féin is a firmly anti-imperialist organization. Hopefully will provide some leadership, for forces around the world. Across Africa, in the Sahel, while we are speaking, there's a conference happening in Niamey, Niger, where the groups from the Sahel have gathered together in an act of solidarity against French aggression, against US imperialism, and so on. Senegal has a progressive government. Sri Lanka has a Marxist government now. There are lots of signs of change, but they are not sufficient. There's not enough quantity of these changes to change the quality of the balance of forces. The left is still weak, but the left is not non-existent. I mean, to win an election, to win the presidential election in Sri Lanka as a Marxist, and then to dissolve parliament where you only had 4 seats, and to come back with a 2/3 majority, that says something. It's not a nothing. Sri Lanka is a major country in the world. Senegal, the government is a center-left government. I mean, these things are also happening. And I think that's important for people to recognize. Sarah Wagenknecht left Die Linke and went into 2 regional elections this year, winning close to 15% in both. That's extraordinary. The left normally sits at 5%. How did a left-wing force get to 15%? Because they took a strong position against NATO. It appeals to people. It offers a clear path. You're also saying the far right is not the only organization that's talking about stop war. It is remarkable that the collapse of social democracy, the collapse of liberalism, has allowed parts of the far right to become the defenders of peace. I mean, that's just incredible. It's incredible that Tulsi Gabbard, who was a darling of sections of the anti-war left in the United States, is now in the Trump administration with those same ideas. This is all extraordinary. We have to reflect both on the small rise of the left, but also this curiosity of sections of the right adopting the rhetoric of peace, and in some cases, not just the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you mentioned NATO, and I think it's important to talk about this elephant in the room. One of the horsemen of U.S. imperialism. If you can explain NATO and its role in global imperialism, and particularly in what we're describing as hyper-imperialism, and how it manipulates this sort of peace discourse that you're talking about, this human rights discourse, to justify its obviously violent interventions in many countries.
Yeah, NATO is interesting. Formed in 1949, it was part of a range of alliances. Central Alliance, which was based in Baghdad initially, the Manila Pact, which was the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO. There were a whole bunch of these treaty organizations. In fact, in a way, the OAS was part of this, system of treaty organizations. But most of them collapsed during the Cold War, and some of them collapsed subsequent to it. NATO has remained. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the debate emerged within NATO headquarters, where they began to throw around the term global NATO. Can NATO have a global role? And indeed, that's what they work towards, building a global role for NATO. We did a calculation at our institute, and it's in the hyper-imperialism text. We showed that the NATO plus countries account for 74.3% of global military spending. The Chinese for 10%, Russia for 4%. Add the Chinese and Russians together, 14%. I mean, it's no competition. 74.3. It is an extremely destructive force. Trump's insistence that NATO countries expand their military spending is even more chilling. It's also suicidal for these societies. We should see less military spending, not more. They continue to insist on more and more military spending. Look, instead of spending so much on the military, why not rebuild your economies? I don't really get sometimes this thinking. Now, Trump is also being a little bit clever in this, because if he can get, say, Germany to spend more on defense, maybe the US can spend less. But it's not going to work out like that. because, I mean, his thinking is nonsense. You have to then confront the arms lobby in the United States, the weapons manufacturers. They have a grip on society. I mean, United States is one of the only countries in the world where, you have airlines say those who are in the military can board a plane first. This doesn't happen in any country in the world. Thank you for your service. I mean, it's the arms industry that's rooted itself in the culture. It's not soldiers. Soldiers are not. How many soldiers are flying on planes? Okay, most of them don't have the money to fly on planes that often. They fought wars, came back, and are broke. They are not the wealthy. They don't decide to fly planes over the Super Bowl. On Super Bowl Sunday. They don't do all of that. It's the arms industry that does all of that. They have a grip on the culture. And so, if Trump thinks, oh, I'll get Germany to raise its military spending, then the US can decrease it. It's not going to happen. He has to confront the arms industry. I don't see him doing that. The far right doesn't have the stomach to take on the arms industry, but we have to. We have to now, even in our weakness.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Nick.
You go.
No, yeah, I was in terms of with Trump's role in the further development of NATO and its policies. Again, as you mentioned in the beginning, don't seem that much different from potential Kamala's. They seem pretty unilateral in that regard, unilateral support for NATO and its expansion. It seems to be one of the few institutions that carries sort of ideological weight in terms of, like we were mentioning before, peace discourse and human rights discourse. And I think this is particularly pertinent in the Ukraine conflict. If you could speak a little bit on what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and the role that the sort of subtle, at least the majority of the American public, a fairly subtle role that NATO is playing and what their intentions actually are in that conflict.
I mean, this is a really dangerous situation because, until recently, the NATO powers provided Ukraine with weapons, but with the proviso that these weapon systems were to be used on Ukrainian soil against Russian targets. In other words, to repel the Russian entry into Ukraine. But now Biden and Keir Starmer, Biden as a lame duck president, has given permission, and the Ukrainians have used that permission to launch long-range missiles into Russian territory. This is the huge escalation. Very dangerous because Russia has now revised its nuclear first use strategy. We should be going in the opposite direction of this, not increasing the nuclear trigger. The doomsday clock maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Energy scientists is at 90 seconds to midnight. It's the closest it's been to Armageddon. Now, I'm not a great exaggerator of things, but my God, this is insane. Mr. Biden's party lost the election. Shouldn't he wait until January for a new direction to be pushed by the thing? I mean, I know that constitutionally, Biden still has the presidency till January. But, they were defeated in the election. Shouldn't he have consulted with the incoming president on this? Because it is actually designed to trap Mr. Trump into the war in Ukraine, which he has said he wants to extricate the United States from funding. Having allowed US missiles to fire into Russian territory, what if Russia retaliates at a US base or something like that? Fires a missile into a base, US base in Germany or somewhere, Ramstein base. What will happen then? Will the United States have to be compelled to respond? This is a nightmare. I'm hoping that Russia will not retaliate against US targets so as not to, take the provocation. But this is where we are. We're in a very difficult and dangerous situation. And I think, I don't walk into this believing that, say, Trump is the Antichrist. And I also don't walk into this believing that Trump is a savior. I just think the contradictions that Biden has put into play and that Trump will inherit are very interesting. And I hope that 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 there will not be altogether too many provocations that lead us to further international conflict. I mean, if Mr. Trump wants to make nice with the Russians, that's fine by me, as if it ends the war in Ukraine. But then Trump is going to find that the Russians are not going to break their alliance with the Chinese. They feel that they tried this once before and the West betrayed them. So I don't think Putin is going to go in that direction. On the other hand, if that's the expectation that leads to the end of the war in Ukraine, that's one war that we have actually ended, one war less in the world.
Yeah. I think when I heard you talking about it, it was very telling to me that Biden's priorities in his lame duck, days and weeks left is to be funding and supplying and accelerating this war and not protecting Americans, rights or securing democracy, not any of the things that they claim when they call Trump a fascist. He's not worried about any of that. He's worried about arming Ukraine to the teeth.
Yeah, very, very, very decadent, very hyper-imperialist.
Yeah.
And that has me wondering of I think there's this contradiction between profit and business and war, and its destructiveness. On some level, nuclear war is not good for business. If you think about it from a purely capitalistic standpoint. And as NATO has expanded eastward, this threat of nuclear conflict has increased. Why does NATO feel the need to expand eastward, even when that could threaten its market stability and, could crash the whole economy?
I mean, irrational thinking has not been unusual in the world of the capitalist elites. They're pretty irrational. For instance, they know that their personal gain is sometimes antisocial. And if you create more and more antisocial things, that will go against your ability for personal gain. Your profits will decrease. The unreason is something that is pretty inherent in the system. It also is what prevents planning. It actually prevents monopolies from developing, which is also interesting. Monopolies are prevented because individualistic attitudes prevail. Sometimes, like, people don't want to collude with others; they want to destroy them. These are the things, irrationalities that govern the system. In this case, what's quite interesting is that the advance eastward is driven by a set of competing motives. One is this feeling that the United States, particularly over the last decade, is worried that Eastern Europe has become more and more interested in China. 17 Eastern European countries signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative. Germany was integrating with Russia and China. German manufacturing happens in China largely. All of this had the United States rather unhappy. And there was an attempt in a way to win back Europe. And NATO was that instrument. Because, free trade agreements with the US are meaningless. What is to be gained by them? But NATO was the instrument. And that's why NATO expansion became so important.
So China is at the core of the desire for NATO to expand,
Yeah, I mean, I
sphere of
actually
influence.
I looked at those. If you go and look back at the 17 countries and then Italy, or European countries that joined the Belt and Road Initiative, it's that belt of Eastern European states into which NATO has been trying to poke its nose. The issue of economic integration. You see, that's slightly different from sphere of influence. Sphere of influence is a real thing. What you just mentioned, it's a real thing. Countries feel like they have, let's say, linguistic kinship and so on. That then they feel like, why are other people poking their nose? There's now a little squabble taking place between India and the US over whether the US should be allowed to interfere in Nepal. Sphere of influence. This is a real thing. But in Eastern Europe, it was also economic integration. Germany was integrated into Russian energy markets and into Chinese manufacturing capacity. That was what was broken. The blowing up of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, symbolic of trying to sunder the increasing integration of Western Europe and Eastern Europe. to Russia and China. I think that's the key thing. This kind of Eurasian integration on economic terms had to be forbidden by a military, expanding the military alliance of the Atlantic states.
Hearing you talk about China and thinking about how much it plays a role in what the U.S. is trying to do worldwide and what NATO is trying to combat, really makes me want to ask you, why do you feel like China was so successful in navigating the treacherous waters of hyper-imperialism, whereas the USSR and other socialist projects really seemed to struggle under the neoliberal era and collapse in the 90s?
And I mean, some of this really is also timing. I think in 78, in the 70s, the Soviets were trying various reforms. But I don't think what was very clear was the importance of high-tech production. And also the Soviets, I think, made a calculation that by and large may not have been a good one. You see, the calculation is about how much to spend on the military. China spends on the military, but it's built a defensive military. It's not actually trying to build fleets of ships all over the world and, for world conquest. Soviets spent a lot of money maintaining a parity with the United States, ability to, attack all of the US. The Chinese have enough of a nuclear arsenal that they feel that the US can't attack them by nuclear because they can fire off and enough nuclear weapons will hit the United States. But they're not trying to expand their nuclear arsenal. They're not trying to build many, many more aircraft carriers. One is enough here. There's a balance in that. And because of that, because of the understanding of high tech in 78, the Chinese went out to Japan, to Singapore, and they had an advantage, which the Russians didn't have. That countries which had a close historical relationship with China had made breakthroughs. Like Japan, like South Korea, like Singapore, and so on. And these countries actually helped China. Japanese factory owners, came to Beijing and said, listen, we have a debt to pay to China, to Chinese civilization. We're going to show you how to do this, blah, blah, blah. The Russians didn't have that. The Russian, overseas Russian zones didn't exist. They didn't have, a tiger somewhere in Scandinavia, that had a loyalty to Russia in some interesting cultural way and said, let's help you out. I mean, history is interesting. Things don't repeat. And also there are very unusual configurations. China was fortunate in that. Of course, the other thing was that China didn't permit a Gorbachev to appear in their darkest period. They didn't allow this. The Soviet Union had multiple experiences with this kind of revisionism. Khrushchev, his arrival, he brought in ideas that had to be really tempered, and he couldn't complete a term. Yeah, but he nonetheless appeared. It showed a weakness in the system. Gorbachev's appearance, bringing in people like Boris Yeltsin, showed a weakness in the Communist Party's understanding of what would make for good leadership. In China, this is part of the internal struggle. There are 90 million members of the party, who is, for instance, going to come after Xi Jinping, who's in the National Bureau, who's in the standing committees. How do they choose leadership? They have not developed a revisionist. Deng Xiaoping was definitely not a revisionist. Deng Xiaoping took the long view of economic development, but he was firmly committed to, a socialist society under the leadership of a communist party. That commitment wasn't there with Gorbachev, and so you're not going to see a repeat in China. The West has searched for a Gorbachev for decades now. For the Chinese, they can't find the person.
Yeah, I think especially after seeing what happened in Russia, I think, watching sort of a institutional suicide, for lack of a better word, it becomes a lot less attractive taking, American advice about democracy or liberalization. I wanted to switch gears, if that's okay. You were recently in Venezuela. I heard for the election of Nicolas Maduro, and I was wondering what your experience was of that election.
I mean, look, elections are always difficult, and I can't gauge an election because, when an election is happening in a huge country of almost 27 million people or whatever, you can't see everything. And there was a lot of chit chat and thing about how the election was stolen. Obviously, nobody has any clue. The scale is too big. On the other hand, something was weird. Just a few days before the election, there was a poll released by Edison Research in New Jersey. Edison Research is a group that basically is a contractor for the various CIA front groups. They do work for things like Radio Free Europe and so on. Anyway, this group released a poll showing that showing that the opposition was going to win by 70 to 30%. It's a completely ludicrous margin. And when that didn't happen, then the US newspaper said the election was stolen. Look at this poll. Well, even in the closest election, which was the year after Hugo Chavez died, Nicolas Maduro won by something like 51% to 49%, 2% margin. The opposition simply cannot win 70% of the vote. If anything, it may get 50 plus 1%. It just can't get 70. That was a myth. But they used that, what I think of as a garbage poll. There was no methodology released, nothing. They used that to say the election was stolen. Now, everybody I talk to, including sections of the opposition, say quite clearly that, look, the Chavistas have a huge base of support. And if anything, it's a 50-50 electorate. In the end of the day, this election suggested something like 54 to 44 or somewhere around there. Still a close election, still within a 50-50 range, but the government won. Now, don't like it, what can you do? The United States was not keen on accelerating tension in Venezuela because the US is eager to bring Venezuelan oil to Europe to substitute for Russian oil. Very eager. So these are the contradictions, And so in a way, it was the far right of a special type in Venezuela that was trying to, to create a crisis. But the US government was really not interested and they sort of let it go. Fascinating to watch that. The day of the election, I thought, oh my God, the opposition is going to draw the US into something. But, I had written an article a few days before saying I doubt the US is interested because it needs the oil to go through Italy and Spain into Europe. And there's no other substitute for Venezuelan oil for the European economy. So they really wanted to create a peaceful election situation, which is why they framed the Barbados agreement between the opposition and the Venezuelan government in 2023 in anticipation of the election. It was ridiculous. Somebody was trying to create mischief, but large parts of the US establishment were not interested.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the more recent things I heard about Venezuela, were they not vetoed by Brazil to enter BRICS? Was that Venezuela most recently?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're gonna end on this this last question or on Venezuela in general. But if you want to mention the possibilities for resistance in BRICS and maybe even what Venezuela joining would mean for U.S. interests in their oil and whatnot, but maybe just explaining the potentials for resistance to U.S. hegemony in BRICS and what they can offer and maybe some hope for our listeners,
Yeah, I mean, BRICS is important. There was a meeting in Kazan in Russia, of the BRICS summit, and rather than expand the BRICS further, they brought in certain partner partner countries that included Cuba and others. So BRICS is, primarily a trading bloc. It's increasingly becoming a political bloc as well, but it's not a military bloc. It's not a military alliance. The great decadent threat that comes from hyper-imperialism is a military threat. And it's not even, the BRICS are not a military alliance, nor is the strategic alliance between Russia and China. They haven't signed a military security alliance. It's merely a security alliance. They will look out for each other's security. It's not a military alliance in that if one is attacked, the other does not have to come to its aid. There is no such treaty alliance of the BRICS in military terms. Indeed, the BRICS militaries are pretty weak in comparison to NATO, but in trade terms, it is the world's largest bloc. And when it comes to energy reserves, it has most of the world's energy because Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, they are all BRICS members. Because it is pretty inevitable Venezuela will become part of BRICS. When Venezuela becomes a part of BRICS, apart from the United States, which is one of the world's large producers of energy, most of them will be under the BRICS umbrella. And that's something for the Western countries to consider. These countries might drive a new energy policy. They might decide to have a two-tier energy billing system where poorer countries get energy for cheaper. They bill rich countries more. All of these kinds of things might form part of a BRICS going forward if it becomes more political. It's not quite political yet, but it's getting there. And when it does, well, then we'll have to see. The US has always opposed alliances in the third world. It opposed the Bandung Conference of 55. It opposed the non-aligned movement of 61. It opposed the BRICS. But these things keep having a way of forming. People keep trying to establish new ways of building global democracy. Can't keep talking about democracy and then tell people not to gather in association. That's exactly what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Vijay, for taking the time and talking to us. I especially appreciated your visions of a better society. I think Nick and I can sometimes get hung up on a critique of the current situation and forget to imagine what it is we're fighting for. So, and everything else, we appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you.
I learned so much.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, guys. Really, I would talk to you forever, but it's beginning to get late in Santiago, and I'm beginning to get sleepy.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to escape from you. Thanks a lot, though.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.